Hi fellow Dreamin! Welcome to my musical analysis on Drippin's villain era. To be honest, I don't know if others have made their own analyses in the past, however I thought I'd give it a shot by connecting the title tracks Villain, Zero, and The One. Before we get started, I'd first like to say that I'm not a professional musician. Outside of studying it in academic settings, I'm just a fan of music and other artistic elements in media. These are all of my personal opinions, and I'd love to hear yours as well. Let's dive in. Starting with Villain, the first thing that gets your attention is the funky bass line. So you can hear this bass line throughout the entire song. It is a continuous motif. It kind of enhances this feeling of them being suave and mature. And as the video is obviously portraying villains, you start to associate that bass line with villains naturally. There are parts that you'll hear, especially in the bridge, that has this kind of like deep and menacing vibe. I recommend having headphones for this part just because I think you'll get the full scope of the sound, and I'll stop talking so you can hear what I'm talking about. Alright, and there's just like a couple of fun little elements that I personally love and want to point out. The first one is the use of Joker's famous line, "Why so serious?" It's great because it not only ties us back into the theme of this infamous villain type of vibe, but it also ties into the choreography. Baby, why so serious? Another interesting element that I wanted to point out is specifically during Dong Yoon's part. It's kind of showcasing this hacker type of power. In the music during this part of the verse, it actually follows a different melody, and it uses instrumentation that feels a little bit more electronic and metallic. So I feel like in that way they really were intentional about the way they paired the music with the visual elements that were happening on screen. And I'll go ahead and play the clip here.
I'm the villain. Yo, it's dripping like dripping cause 나를 자극해 Wanna take you back 집어삼킬래 What you gonna do 너는 나의 trigger 저리가 buster 재워버려 tension.
Alright, so I know it sounds like I probably said a lot, but we're going to move on to the next thing. The important thing to keep in mind from this past analyses is the idea of villains being associated with a funky bass line. Alright, so let's talk about Zero. For the purposes of my analysis, I'm going to keep the order as Villain, Zero, and then The One, because I feel like if you start looking at Zero as a prequel, it'll get a little bit more confusing. Now, as opposed to Villain, which started off with a smooth and suave, funky little bass line, we have Zero, which starts off with a rather discordant guitar riff. This is the first introduction of what I'm going to call the heroes.
I can be Zero, I can be.
Now in Zero, you can still hear a menacing sounding bass motif that's carried throughout, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the guitar has a much more shrill and higher sound, and it feels as if the two are almost in a heated match against one another. So I kind of started associating the heroes with the guitar and the villains with the bass. So in this song, there's a lot of the blending of the two, and it feels sort of like a duel is happening. Now back to the little bass motif that I was talking about earlier. It's actually my favorite part of this song. There's a descending chromatic scale that has this very traditional villain theme song sound. It feels like the foreshadowing of something ominous or the plot twist that leaves audiences in shock. So even though the guitar is kind of like the focal point of the song, this piece of it definitely shows that the villains are still intact. And then something random that I just think is interesting is in the chorus, the layering of the voices just feels a little bit operatic, a little bit uncanny. The closest thing that I can kind of compare it to in K-pop is EXO's Mama. There is just something about that chanting that feels very villain-esque. And I'll let you listen to it here. Zero, 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 zero from bed. Cross like zero, 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 zero from bed. Alright, and last up we have The One. So in kind of listening to the director's cut and behind the scenes stuff, you really got the vibe that they were trying to go for something epic. And I feel like you can see that through line. We're starting off with this kind of villain motif that goes into a war between the villains and the heroes. And then you're ending with something that is kind of taking over. The guitar is kind of the main focus. Tone-wise, it's less dark, it's upbeat, and then the heavy bass is just less prominent overall to let that guitar take over. And the repeated guitar riff actually feels like something that you would hear after walking away from a battle having won. All in all, I feel like they do a really good job with this series of creating something that feels like it has a beginning, a middle, an end. You see the intro, the climax, the conclusion. But to also kind of hear it, I think is what's really interesting about the villain art. Now, I have a different kind of interpretation depending on if you're looking at it from following the plot line specifically, but I don't really think I have the time to get into it right now. I'm curious if there are other things that you felt like were really interesting, if there are Drippin fans out there that have a little bit more terminology or have other cool things that they could bring to the table. I'd also love to hear your thoughts and your expertise. Thank you for watching. I hope this encourages you to go and listen to more Drippin music and kind of pick out the different things that you can hear within their songs and their melodies. And until next time.